Okay, welcome back, and we are now moving on to lecture 5. Lecture 5 being to discuss and apply aerobic training guidelines in children and youth, and how this relates to your training regime that you will be using, especially with the growth related changes that happen. So the questions that were posed were based on the article that you read and how you did this together in groups. After reading Gamble, aim to answer the following. So the first question is, although we should train both the aerobic and the anaerobic system before puberty, children are more primed for aerobic training. Using information on the physiological differences in terms of the energy systems on a cellular level, discuss this. Okay, so the research has shown that before puberty takes place, we know that the muscle mass of children is less compared to post-puberty. And the reason for this is that children have not yet had that injection of testosterone, whether it be male or female, or estrogen, which causes their muscle mass to increase. Also, with type 2 fibers, type 2 fiber proliferation tends to happen post-puberty, and also the neural system tends to citate these muscle fibers more, which have a different energy system, which is more primed for either glycolysis or ATP-PC system energy production. Whereas with type 1 muscle fibers in children, research shows that children tend to have more type 1 muscle fibers before puberty, which primes them more for fat oxidation or aerobic type of activities. Also, because they have less muscle in the body, their ability to store glucose in the muscles, and also the presence of glycolytic enzymes in the muscles is less, hence why their body is more optimized for fat oxidation. Also, in research you'll see that children have a lower respiratory exchange ratio, meaning that from fat oxidation they have less carbon dioxide produced in the body, leading their respiratory exchange ratio to be more of 0.7 versus 1. Those of you who have done this with Mark will understand what I'm referring to when I say 0.7 versus 1. With 1 being more energy coming from glycolysis or from carbohydrate use, and with a value less than 1 coming from more from fat oxidation. I'm going to go through each point in a little bit more detail now, so I'm sure at this point you might be a little bit confused with all the terms referring to type 1 muscle fibers, fat oxidation, glycolytic enzymes, and so forth, but just bear with me as I give you a quick overview. And then of course, if there's less glycolysis and ATP-PC production, children have less buildup of lactic acid compared to adults, which is an advantage when it comes to long duration activities. So children pre-puberty are more primed for aerobic type activities versus anaerobic type activities. So let's quickly look a little bit more into the literature, because I'm sure you would want a little bit more information on this. So metabolic and hormonal responses to exercise in children and adolescents. Now I think what's quite interesting here from the research that was conducted and what I've just discussed, the main reasons why aerobic training is more prominent in children and why it should be optimized pre-puberty for longer durations is because there appears to be a high proportion of slow twitch fibers, which I've just stated now, in the actual muscle itself, allowing children more opportunity for aerobic production, right? In other words, fat oxidation, or the use of fat oxidation or fats to get energy. And anaerobic glycolytic ATP may be reduced in young individuals during high intensity exercise. Reduced activity and lactic acid buildup in prepubertal children could also explain the lower glycolytic capacity and limited production of muscle lactate acid relative to adults, which means that children can go for much longer without getting the body fatigued, which has its benefits but also has its negatives, as children, although they may not be fatiguing due to lactic acid buildup, their muscles are still being damaged during the normal aerobic type activity. So they're also still having those forces imposed on their body, so you must still have a cutoff when you're training them, even though they might seem like they can go on forever. These observations may be related to reduced sympathetic responses to exhaustive resistance exercises in young people. In contrast, children and adolescents are well adapted to prolonged exercise of moderate intensity. Growth and maturation induce increase in muscle mass with proliferation in mitochondria and contractile proteins. So basically, in a nutshell, as you get older, you get an increase in muscle mass and you have more mitochondria, and then with more mitochondria you can have more glycolysis and you can have more ATP-PC production. However, before that, children have less muscle mass, less storage capacity for glucose, and they are more primed hence for fat oxidation. So let's have a look at the next article just for you to read a little bit more up on. Basically, the conclusion being these data suggest that fat oxidation relative to total calorie expenditure is higher in prepubescent children than adults. Consistent with current dietary guidelines, a moderate fat diet is important for children because they use fat as their main input. And again, a lot of parents limiting fat intake by children. It's important to know, due to a child's physiology, they are more prone or suited to aerobic type of training, and the aerobic type of training uses fat oxidation to produce the energy requirements for the training that they are doing. Hence, healthy fats should be included in a child's diet or training protocol. Okay, I quite like this, although it is an online website. This individual coaching the young athlete, really it discusses aerobic versus anaerobic development in children quite well. So again, have a look. I'm going to go through it slowly, so you can just stop the screen when you want to read through it, but I would read through this document to really get an overview of the difference between a child's aerobic capacity, their cardiovascular function, but also the benefits that children have compared to adults, mainly being that their aerobic capacity is primed before puberty, and then after puberty with the anaerobic system primed, because there's more mitochondria and muscles, that system can be optimized in terms of a training. So this doesn't mean that you only do cardiovascular training in young children. In other words, longer duration training bouts. You would throw in some short high intensity volume training bouts, but this might be to a less extent than the longer duration activities. And I'll share with you a training program now, but again, for you to know the basics. So I like this where he discusses that children are basically aerobic animals. All these factors reduce physiological efficiency. Combine these biomechanical and physiological limiters lead to reduced running economy, though this seems to improve with age from 8 to 20 years old. Although they are biomechanically and physiologically inefficient, as we've already discussed, children aren't and if you've read the sections before, their heart rates are smaller, their stroke volumes are smaller, their lungs are smaller compared to adults, their running mechanics are poorer compared to adults. Although all of those negatives are present, children are optimized for aerobic metabolism and can basically run forever if they were allowed the opportunity to do so. Some studies actually being conducted on children and children participating in marathons. Again, take into account monetary systems required and making sure that children do not overheat, because they obviously have a larger surface area compared to adults, and hence can overheat a lot quicker. And then also that they do not have the warning system in place, the lactic acid buildup, because they do not have as much glycolysis or ATP-PC production, leading to lactic acid production. Okay, so just have a read here. The argument in terms of aerobic versus anaerobic training in children, and then the concluding comments. It's useful for coaches to know that aerobic capacity is probably trainable in children with sufficient training stimulus. Again, making sure that you still work at the correct heart rate intensities, heart rate reserve, and training children between your 60 to 85% of their VO2 max, which you can work out from conducting either a treadmill ergometer assessment, a cycle ergometer assessment, something that you have not done in this module, but that you must just be aware of. And then of course we have quite a few other aerobic assessments we can do with children. Bleep test to be one example, and then you can work out from there what their VO2 max is, and then what their training heart rate intensity should be when training their cardiovascular system. Okay, so muscle fiber type, just so you know, as I said, in children they seem to have more type 1 muscle fibers, and then as puberty hits it goes more to, or there's more fast twitch fibers. So this just highlights the aerobic capacity, but again the major fuel source being fats that children use. And then of course the respiratory exchange ratio, just giving you a picture here. As you get closer to 1 of respiratory exchange ratio, you use more carbohydrates, and as you get closer to 0.7 you use more fats. So again, just looking at your respiratory exchange ratio. And then another article on changes of respiratory exchange ratio in children and adolescents, a longitudinal study. Respiratory exchange ratio is the ratio determined by dividing the amount of produced or exhaled carbon dioxide and oxygen consumed. The same value measured at a cellular level represents the respiratory quotient. Okay, and then just read on here what the difference means in terms of what it is: 0.7 indicating fat as the main source, and 1 indicating carbohydrates as the main source. And when they do studies on children, they see fat oxidation is most. So okay, that's all nice to know, and we know now that pre-puberty you should focus more on aerobic training in children, longer durations, but now we obviously need to know practically what does this mean and how do we optimize our development thereof. So coming back, the question is, why is it dangerous that children cannot produce lactic acid buildup for glycolysis as adults do, or from glycolysis? Well, lack of lactic acid buildup means their lactic threshold and fatigue due to acid buildup in the body is not developed, so their anaerobic systems are not developed. Hence, children may seem like they are able to sustain long bouts of exercise, but their muscles and tendons and ligaments are not able to support this. So you got to have rest periods and cutoffs, which I'll show you shortly. If it is dangerous to train children anaerobically, even aerobically, due to their lack of glycolysis, how can you monitor them? So again, heart rate monitoring, percent of heart rate reserve, using the FIT principles guidelines for your session as depicted in the slides below. I'll show you that now. Assess body form changes, and when posture starts to decrease, increase rest periods. So again, monitoring heart rate monitor on your child, whoever you're training, and then obviously knowing what training guidelines there are for the aerobic training itself or anaerobic training, and assess body form. And as soon as body form starts to decrease, increase your rest periods. I think after reading these documents on what children are capable of in terms of their aerobic running ability, I think RPE might be difficult to use as assessment tool because of the lack of lactic acid buildup in their body, because they do not have the muscle capacity to store glucose, and of course then they do not have as many mitochondria to increase the amount of glycolysis and ATP-PC production. So again, the energy production system going more into fat oxidation. So Itzvan Bailey and colleagues do indicate that RPE can be used. So I would say I would use RPE in conjunction with heart rates and the FIT guidelines. And again, keep it fun. Although you are monitoring young athletes, you need to keep it fun. So maybe just an example here. For your younger children, make up a story about how the heart is amazing because it can pump up to 200 beats per minute. But we don't want the heart rate to beat at such a high rate for a long time, because our heart has a specific heart loving zone. So let's see if we can keep our heart rates in our heart loving zones today. And you would of course work out the child's heart rate or heart rate reserve and intensity of training session in terms of 60, 70, 80 or 90% of their training session. And if you read a little bit more in depth there, you can see the exact percentages to train the child at or adolescent at, and then of course put in the relative safety guidelines. Okay, so going on, why is it even important for female athletes? Why is it more important for female athletes than males to focus on maintaining their aerobic capacity? Well, a lot of athletes or people tend to forget about the effects of puberty on the female population group, but female population groups have an increase in fat mass gain, so it's even more important to ensure that your females are well trained before the onset of puberty in terms of the aerobic capacity, so that they can counter that effect. After puberty, which aerobic versus anaerobic training will help improve VO2 max? That's your next question. So as I already mentioned, I think I've created enough evidence for the fact that aerobic training or longer duration training is best for young children, but that after that you go into your proper VO2 max training, which is interval training, has been found to be beneficial with intensity of up to 90% of heart rate reserve. Again, working out, there's the method for heart rate reserve, how you would calculate it, and you would work at 90% of heart rate reserve for your youth group post-puberty. Even though metabolism improves, glycolysis increases due to muscle mass gain, so you've got to train that system to optimize it. What causes the improvement in aerobic performance in children and youth? So again, as we've mentioned, of course as children age, they increase in muscle mass, and with increase in muscle mass there's more storage capacity for glucose, and also there are more mitochondria, which increases their anaerobic capacity. However, before those changes, they have their aerobic capacity optimized because of fat oxidation. Increased economy of movement, especially in children pre-puberty. So I've already emphasized in class why it is so important to do correct motor training development in the young population group, so that by the time they get to an adult phase, they are, well, not adult but adolescent phase, their movement capacity and their neural capacity and motor learning capacity is optimized. So increased economy of movement will improve aerobic performance in children and youth. You got to start young. Got to teach them how to run properly from young, in a fun and age appropriate way, of course. And interval training versus the long duration runs in children. There are a few contradictory statements in the text. I'm sure you came across this. So again, keeping the intervals of young children at an aerobic training capacity, optimizing on that fat oxidation, setting the foundation for a strong heart and lung function, so that when puberty takes place, the lactic acid can be removed quickly from the system, but that due to glycolysis, but that the aerobic system is optimized. But there seems to be a for pre-puberty both a emphasis on aerobic and interval training. Okay, recommendations for aerobic training in pre-adolescence: provide opportunities for children to self-regulate their training. In other words, perhaps like fartlek training, as they do not have glycolysis and they do not have that lactic acid buildup. But I would, in addition to that, not just leave it to the children, because I've already said children cannot necessarily monitor themselves. I would have a heart rate reserve calculation. I would have a heart rate monitor. I would stick to my FIT principle guidelines, and I would watch their form, their body form changes, and how much fun they're having or not having. So not just fartlek training in terms of making up their own mind when they want to stop and start. Keep high intensity durations of less than 15 seconds, just in case. Again, making them sprint full out at 85 to 90% of their heart rate reserve for young children. This is slightly different to the prescription in the text, which I can show you the outline here of 10 to 30 second sprints. So again, some contraindications in the sprint in the text, but let's stick to the guidelines in the actual document itself over here, where we have the specific guidelines in your actual document. So table 9.1 and 9.2. Okay, and variety of movements to provide more neuromuscular training and prevent overtraining. So again, early specialization in sport is going to lead to possible damage to the musculoskeletal system. So you are wanting to look at a variety of training, especially in your youth group. And then studies in young children have shown that improvements between 8 and 11-year-olds have resulted from long duration activities of 15 to 20 minute runs. Again, doing that longer duration type of running where the child actually maintains their aerobic training for 15 to 20 minutes. Doing 80 to 85 maximal aerobic speeds repeatedly for 6 to 20 minutes. Well, maximum aerobic speed can also be referred to as the VO2 max. And if you are running at 80 to 85 of your VO2 max for 6 to 12 minutes, that is quite intense. So studies have been done though where they've shown this in children. And then 5 to 30 second sprints of maximal aerobic speeds with 10 to 30 second rests in between. So again, somewhat contradicting the actual guidelines given in the text for training regimes. So for now, for the purpose of this module and for the literature that is available, we will focus on these tables as our main guiding resource. So again, those of you who want to take a break, you're welcome to stop the video at any time. I'm just going to finish off this section now, just showing you the actual practical applications of everything I've just said. So develop an aerobic training program for prepubertal child, and I've just given you example prepubertal being basically 4 to 12 years old, and the types of activities you will do them. So we have now just started with our fundamental movement skill training programs, and already the text has indicated that to improve aerobic performance, if you improve running economy, basically motor skill ability and motor ability in running or in motor skills, you will improve aerobic capacity. But also if you focus on aerobic bouts of, according to the documents, 4-minute bouts ranging between 90 to 4-minute bouts, right? Self-regulated intensity and a moderate volume. Consider alternating short and longer overall durations for sessions on consecutive days. You can optimally train the children that you're working with. And this really comes down to age-appropriate activities that you do with them. So again, although not within the scope of our module, and this would be something for you to do with the Foundations of Movement module. Yeah, it's just an overview where you do strength and conditioning on Tuesdays, strength and conditioning on Thursdays. You do a variety of activities of locomotor and object control skills on the Mondays and Wednesdays. You can have dance, you can have martial arts, you can have gymnastics, you can have ball skills, and the individual running the session can have up to 4-minute aside games or 90-second sprints and 10 to 30-second sprinting type activities with alternate days of low intensity bouts. Saturdays again, playing games, teaching games for understanding. Again, read up on that pedagogical approach, and then going for hikes or adventure games and so forth, and playing in the park. So just an overview then of that, having a look pre-puberty, slightly more aerobic based activity versus the next group of information where it is more VO2 max based and a lot more high intensity. Okay. So moving on, if we look at the next clip, so again, just to emphasize, cross training and skill-based training important to improve economy of movement because all other systems are not well developed in pre-puberty. Moving on, 12 years and plus, just around the onset of peak height velocity, sport-specific conditioning. Now you go more to sport-specific conditioning versus fundamental movement skill training and skill-based training, and you would work at much higher intensities. Your aerobic capacity base should be set, but you're now trying to optimize your aerobic VO2 max training with high intensity interval training. Don't forget your strength training, don't forget your recovery runs, and don't forget that you take longer rests because you're now post-puberty, muscle mass increases, so you're going to have more glycolysis and lactic acid buildup. So let's quickly have a look at that. Running-based conditioning, long aerobic bouts, 90 to 66 minute bouts. Short aerobic intervals 10 to 30 seconds, and aerobic anaerobic 20 second bouts, 20 second rest. So again, you would have to, as a coach, work this into your training regime, and remember, periodization of training is important. Not within the scope of this module. For me, the most important thing for you to know is the growth and developmental effects of the changes in body systems that affect fat oxidation and affect glycolysis. Okay, and then the last one, post-pubertal athletes, conditioning games, skill-based conditioning again, running-based conditioning, cross-training. And this all applies to the sport, 90 seconds to 6 minute work bouts, short aerobic 10 to 30 second work bouts, 20 seconds with 10 second work bouts, and 5 to 30 second sprints. So again, have a look at the overall feedback and then a basic training program, but this will be specific to the person's needs. Post-pubertal, sport-specific Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but you would have to take into account microcycles, mesocycles, macrocycles, and refer to BOMPA, who is the training authority in terms of that. Okay. So I think that is enough in terms of the aerobic versus anaerobic conditioning in children and youth. Again, refer to the reading material if you're really concerned about understanding this section of the work. But in general, guidelines being the glycolysis versus ATP-PC and fat oxidation and how each affects the child's metabolism, but also take into account thermoregulation and the volume or size of the individual's body compared to adults, and so forth. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Otherwise, that is the aerobic system in conjunction to growth and development covered.